further than that. Of course, obviously the grave difficulty for the average individual is if he says, they ask some question, let's say, they ask him his income or his grandmother's name or whatever, and he refuses to respond. Well, then there will be some immediate consequence. In his case, I think they handcuffed him, right?
Right.
And they took him into some separate room and they started grilling him. So there'll be this immediate consequence. And obviously people are not going to face that consequence if they're going to miss their flight or what, that type of thing. You'll lose their vacation because they're tied up and miss the flights. And then what's his response to this? Well, I guess he's going to have to sue somebody, right? So you're talking about court time and lawyers' fees and all the rest. So I suppose the short answer is you've got a group of people there who are, what shall I say, submarginally trained, these TSA operatives. And, they're pushing their weight around because they have a badge and a uniform. And they know pretty much that almost anything that they do to people within certain limits, I guess they couldn't beat them with baseball bats, but within certain limits, they're not going to be drawn on the carpet, they're not going to be disciplined, they're not going to be fined, they're not going to be punished anyway. So it's a way for them to show what tough guys they are and to feel important. And what was one going to do about it? I think this thing has to be corrected at another level.
Well, how?
It's a long march. I think we've got to start at the state level. We've got to gain control of our state governments first.
I have a quick question practically about the TSA interactions. Do people constitutionally have to give their private information to the people at TSA? What is the truth about that?
No.
And I also
I'm not so sure whether he was involved with TSA or whether he was involved with Border Patrol people.
Well, I think TSA brought in Border Patrol.
Yes, it's an interesting question because the Border Patrol people, if you're actually crossing the border into the United States, they have some more leeway there because they can literally keep you from crossing the border. Now, if you're dealing with TSA, say where you're inside the United States traveling from one city to another, then they are theoretically limited to information related to that particular travel event. So, I mean, they could look at your ticket and ask you, where are you going? You say, well, I'm going to Atlanta. Okay, fine. If they say, well, after you're in Atlanta, who are you going to visit there? No. They're not entitled to know that. They're not entitled to know if they find $500 in your pocket where that came from or what you intend to do. You remember that event with the Ron Paul campaign organizer?
Yes, I do. It was public, though. It was all over the news.
Right, all over the news, right? And they were trying to grill him because he had checks or cash or whatever that he had collected for the Ron Paul campaign.
Right.
Now, it turned out, of course, that the authorities, TSA and others, said, well, they weren't entitled to that information. Absolutely they weren't entitled to that information. Your difficulty is you're there with some thug, basically, who's pushing his weight around, and you tell him, well, you're not entitled to that information. Well, I'm going to take you to this other room and handcuff you. This is our difficulty because there's no enforcement mechanism to deal with those people. And that's because we've allowed the national government, the government in Washington, to get out of control, and that's because we've allowed the state governments not to assert their role in this system.
How would that manifest itself at this point with regard to TSA?
Well, it won't manifest itself at this point with regard to TSA because we've got to do a lot of things before we get to TSA.
I also think that TSA representatives, when they ask those questions, I think that 90% of the conflicts happen with the way they're answered. Not with what's said, but with the way they're answered. I just have a feeling on a human dynamic take that it wouldn't even matter what people said as long as they participated in the game. It's tragic.
Oh, you mean if they were respectful?
Yeah, well, I mean, if they were respectful and just went with the flow. Doesn't even mean they answer honestly. They just go with the flow. They play the game. Because to show any disdain or disfavor or unpleasantness or disagreement with the game, there's obviously a usurping of power. The people in TSA can abuse their power because they don't have any enforcement or management that says that they can't do it. And so on a practical remedy for the public, it seems to me the human element of just playing the game.
Well, the practical remedy is you just swallow and go ahead and play the game, as you say. But the whole point of the game, it seems to me, on their side, is to put people into the mindset of robotically obeying these supposed superior authorities who have flash a badge and have a uniform. This is the problem.
I agree.
All right?
I agree.
If someone asks an impertinent question just because he has a uniform, and I tell him to go to hell, I'm entitled to tell him to go to hell. And he should actually expect that answer for asking that question. I do not have to grovel before this individual who's acting outside of his authority. That's the difficulty with this country. We've turned everything upside down. And the people who should be subject to criticism are the ones who are refusing to accept criticism. And the ones who are entitled to give criticism are the ones who they think they can punish for criticizing them. It's exactly upside down.
Is our Bill of Rights in force?
Well, everything is still enforced. I mean, the fact that somebody... we have laws against bank robbery. Banks are robbed. Are those laws still in force? Well, I guess they are. Even at the bank that was robbed that afternoon, the laws are still in force. You got to go out and catch the lawbreaker, right? Prosecute him. I mean, we certainly don't expect that the laws are self-enforcing or that no one will ever attempt to violate them. Our difficulty is with the Bill of Rights that the people who should be doing the enforcement, federal or state prosecutor. I mean, if I were a federal prosecutor and some of that nonsense that I've read about with TSA went on, I would prosecute them just to make a show of it. I'd grab one of those guys and prosecute him just to show that you can't get out of line this way. If you've been given a badge and a uniform, especially if you've been given a gun, which some of them have, then there is a terrific responsibility on you to behave, strictly speaking, within the parameters of the law as it applies to your particular job. And if you step one angstrom unit outside of that line, some prosecutor should fall on you like a ton of bricks. There is nothing more dangerous than people abusing official authority. Better to have 100 bank robbers than one policeman who's on the take.
Powerful.
But we don't do that. We do exactly the opposite. Right? They'll chase 1,000 people that are, shaving a few bucks off their tax returns. But what do they do with Geithner?
So, speaking of Geithner, let's talk about how to dethrone the Imperial Judiciary. That's your latest book, right?
Well, that
one of them.
The latest is Constitutional Homeland Security.
Right.
That's one before.
Let's talk about how to dethrone the Imperial Judiciary, and please explain what it is.
Well, the Imperial Judiciary is actually not my title. It's the title the publishers gave it. What they're talking about there is this concept of judicial supremacy, the idea that the courts, and in particular the Supreme Court of the United States, is the final authority on the meaning, application, construction, whatever word you want to use, of the Constitution. The old saying was, Constitution means what the courts say it means, or what the judges say it means. Now that is absolutely, fundamentally, and completely wrong. And how do we know that? We know it in a lot of different ways. First way is, did the Supreme Court exist in 1788 when the Constitution was ratified? No! There was no Supreme Court, there was no Congress, there was no president. They ratified this document. We, the people, in the various conventions in the 13 states, eventually ratified this document. Did the document have a meaning then? Or did they ratify something that no one knew what it meant? Well, of course it had a meaning. Did that meaning derive from some decision of the Supreme Court? Of course it didn't. There was no Supreme Court. Ergo, the Supreme Court cannot be the final authority because it never was the authority.
What is it there for?
Well, it's there to deal with particular cases and controversies, but what do we know? We know that the Supreme Court, like any other body of human beings, can make a mistake. It's admitted that it's made mistakes. There's an opinion, Payne versus Tennessee, which is in, I think, volume 500 of the United States Reports, where there's a footnote that goes on for about a page, listing, and I don't know if it has all of them, but listing what the Supreme Court thought was a complete list of all of the cases in which it had reversed itself on constitutional principles, where it had admitted that it had made an error earlier on. All right?